Think we need to talk. If a woman has ever said these words to you after acting distant, secretive, or different, what I'm about to reveal will shock you to your core. Carl Jung, the legendary psychologist who decoded the human psyche, discovered a pattern in feminine psychology that reveals exactly what women say first when they've been unfaithful. This isn't just about the words themselves. It's about the psychological mechanism behind them that 95% of men completely miss. And when you understand this pattern, you'll never be blindsided by betrayal again. If you want to understand the deepest psychological patterns that govern feminine behavior in relationships, especially during times of crisis and betrayal, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Because what you're about to learn about Jung's insights into feminine psychology during infidelity will change how you see relationships forever. What I'm going to share with you today comes from Jung's extensive work on what he called shadow psychology and how it manifests differently in men and women during relationship crises. When a woman cheats, she doesn't just betray your trust, she activates specific psychological defense mechanisms that Jung mapped out decades ago. The first thing women typically say isn't an admission of guilt. It's not an apology. It's not even anger or blame. It's something far more psychologically complex that reveals the deep, unconscious processes happening in her mind. And when you understand these processes, you'll be able to recognize the signs long before the actual confession happens. Jung discovered that women process guilt, shame, and betrayal through what he called psychological projection and rationalization cycles. This means that when a woman has crossed a line she knows is wrong, her psyche immediately begins creating narratives to protect her self-image and justify her actions. But here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't necessarily about being manipulative or evil. It's about how the feminine psyche protects itself from psychological disintegration when it has acted against its own moral code. Women often have a stronger connection to their emotional and moral center than men, so when they violate their own values, the psychological disruption is more intense. This is why the first thing a woman says when she's been unfaithful often sounds completely disconnected from what she's actually done. Her unconscious mind is trying to create a bridge between her actions and her self-concept. And that bridge is usually built with very specific psychological patterns. The most common first thing women say when they've been unfaithful is some variation of, "I don't feel connected to you anymore," or "something is missing in our relationship." Notice what's happening here psychologically. She's not taking responsibility for her actions. Instead, she's making the relationship itself, or you specifically, responsible for her choices. Jung called this projection of the shadow. The shadow is the part of our psyche that contains everything we don't want to acknowledge about ourselves. When a woman cheats, she has to face the fact that she's capable of betrayal, deception, and hurting someone she claims to love. This threatens her self-image as a good person, so her psyche projects this shadow onto the relationship or onto you. It's not that I'm a cheater, it's that our relationship forced me to seek connection elsewhere. It's not that I'm untrustworthy. It's that you weren't meeting my needs. This projection serves to protect her ego from the full weight of what she's done. But Jung discovered something even deeper. Women often begin this psychological process before they actually cheat. The moment a woman starts seriously considering infidelity, her psyche begins preparing these justifications. This is why you might notice her becoming critical of you or the relationship weeks or even months before anything physical happens. She starts building a case for why cheating would be justified. She begins focusing on everything wrong with the relationship and minimizing everything that's right. She might say things like, "We've grown apart," or "I don't know if we're compatible anymore," not because these things are necessarily true, but because her psyche needs these narratives to justify what she's considering or already doing. Now, before you start panicking about every complaint your partner has ever made, let me clarify something important. Not every criticism means cheating, but there's a specific psychological pattern that Jung identified that's different from normal relationship concerns. Keep watching, because I'm about to reveal the exact signs to look for. The second thing Jung discovered about feminine psychology during infidelity is what he called emotional displacement. Women are generally more emotionally integrated than men, meaning their emotions are more connected to their actions and decisions. So when a woman cheats, she often experiences intense emotional confusion. This emotional displacement manifests in a very specific way. She'll often say something like, "I'm confused about my feelings," or "I don't know what I want anymore." What's really happening is that her emotional system is trying to process the contradiction between her actions and her values. Jung understood that women often experience what he called emotional fragmentation during periods of betrayal. Part of her feels guilty and wrong, part of her feels justified and excited, and part of her feels confused and lost. These conflicting emotions create a psychological state that's genuinely difficult to navigate. But here's the key insight. When a woman says she's confused about her feelings, she's often not confused at all on a deeper level. She knows what she's done or what she's about to do. The confusion is her psyche's way of avoiding full responsibility for her choices. This is why women who are having affairs often seem emotionally volatile or unpredictable. They might be loving and affectionate one moment, then cold and distant the next. They might pick fights over small things, then act like nothing happened. This isn't necessarily calculated manipulation. It's the natural result of emotional fragmentation. Jung also discovered that women going through this process often become hyper-focused on their own emotional experience. They might say things like, "I need to figure out who I am," or "I need space to understand my feelings." While self-discovery is healthy, during infidelity, this language often serves to create emotional distance and justify spending time away from the relationship. Here's something that might surprise you. Jung found that women who cheat often genuinely believe their own justifications. They're not consciously lying. Their psyche has actually convinced them that their narrative is true. This makes these situations even more complex to navigate. But there's more. The third psychological pattern Jung identified is what he called moral inversion. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of feminine psychology during infidelity, and it explains why the first things women say often sound so convincing even when they're completely disconnected from reality. Moral inversion happens when someone's psyche flips their moral framework to make wrong actions feel right. A woman who's cheating might start saying things like, "I deserve to be happy," or "Life is too short to stay in an unfulfilling relationship," or "Sometimes you have to follow your heart, even if it hurts people." Notice how these statements sound almost noble and self-empowering. That's the insidious nature of moral inversion. The psyche takes genuine values, happiness, authenticity, following your heart, and uses them to justify behavior that contradicts other values like loyalty, honesty, and commitment. Jung discovered that women are particularly susceptible to this form of psychological self-deception because they tend to prioritize emotional authenticity and personal fulfillment. These are beautiful qualities in healthy relationships, but during infidelity, they can be weaponized by the psyche to justify betrayal. A woman might genuinely feel that cheating is helping her become more authentic or true to herself. She might believe that staying faithful would be living a lie or betraying her true feelings. This isn't conscious manipulation. It's unconscious psychological gymnastics designed to protect her self-image. This is why arguments with a cheating partner often feel so surreal and frustrating. You're operating from one moral framework. Commitments should be honored, promises should be kept, while she's operating from an inverted framework where breaking commitments becomes a form of integrity. Jung warned that moral inversion is particularly dangerous because it's self-reinforcing. Once someone starts justifying wrong actions through twisted moral reasoning, they often become more convinced of their righteousness over time, not less. I know this is getting heavy, but understanding these psychological mechanisms isn't about becoming cynical. It's about becoming conscious. Jung believed that awareness was the key to both protecting yourself and potentially helping relationships heal. But we're not done yet. The fourth pattern is even more revealing. The fourth psychological pattern Jung identified is temporal displacement. The way women restructure their perception of time and history when they've been unfaithful. This manifests in very specific language patterns that you can learn to recognize. A woman who's cheating will often say things like, "We've been having problems for a long time," or "I haven't been happy for months," or "Our relationship has been dead for years." What's happening psychologically is that she's rewriting history to make her current actions seem inevitable rather than chosen. Jung called this retroactive justification. The psyche goes back through the relationship's history and reframes everything through the lens of current actions. Happy memories get minimized or reinterpreted as fake or surface level. Problems that were minor or resolved get magnified and presented as ongoing, insurmountable issues. This temporal displacement serves several psychological functions. First, it makes the cheating seem like a natural consequence of relationship problems rather than a choice to betray trust. Second, it reduces guilt by suggesting that the relationship was already over in everything but name. Third, it makes the other person, you, partly responsible for the infidelity. But here's what's crucial to understand. This rewriting of history often feels completely real to the woman doing it. Her psyche has actually altered her memories and perceptions to align with her current narrative. She's not necessarily lying when she says, "We've been unhappy for years." She genuinely remembers it that way now. This is why conversations with unfaithful partners often feel like you're living in different realities. You remember the good times, the progress you've made, the love you've shared. She remembers primarily the problems, the disconnection, the reasons why cheating was justified. Jung understood that this temporal displacement is actually a form of psychological self-protection. If a woman had to acknowledge that she destroyed a genuinely good relationship through her own choices, the guilt and shame would be overwhelming. So her psyche protects her by convincing her that the relationship was already damaged beyond repair. Now, you might be wondering, is there any way to break through these psychological defense mechanisms? Can a relationship survive once these patterns are activated? Jung had some surprising insights about this, and they're not what you might expect. The fifth psychological pattern is what Jung called identity fragmentation, and it explains why women who cheat often seem to become completely different people. This manifests in statements like, "I don't know who I am anymore," or "I feel like I'm discovering the real me," or "I've been pretending to be someone I'm not." Identity fragmentation happens because infidelity creates a fundamental split in how a woman sees herself. She has to reconcile being someone who's capable of deception and betrayal with her previous self-image as trustworthy and loyal. Rather than integrating these shadow aspects of herself, she often splits them apart. One identity becomes the real her, the one who's having the affair, following her heart, being authentic. The other identity becomes the false her, the one who was in the committed relationship, following rules, suppressing her true desires. This split allows her to maintain a positive self-image while engaging in behavior that contradicts her stated values. Jung warned that identity fragmentation is particularly dangerous because it can become permanent. If someone spends enough time believing that their unfaithful self is their true self, they may never reintegrate the parts of their personality that were capable of loyalty and commitment. This is why women who have affairs often seem to lose connection, not just with their partner, but with friends and family members who knew them before. They can't maintain relationships with people who remember their false identity because it threatens their new narrative about who they really are. Here's where Jung's insights become really crucial. He believed that understanding these psychological mechanisms wasn't just about recognizing infidelity. It was about understanding the deeper wounds and unmet needs that make people vulnerable to these patterns in the first place. The final patterns I'm about to reveal show you exactly what to look for. The sixth pattern Jung identified is victim identity construction. This is when a woman who's cheating positions herself as the victim in the situation, often saying things like, "You don't understand what I've been going through," or "I felt trapped and had no choice," or "You made me feel invisible, unappreciated, unloved." This victim identity serves multiple psychological functions. It reduces guilt by making her actions seem like responses to mistreatment rather than choices. It generates sympathy and support from others who don't know the full situation. And it makes any anger or hurt from the betrayed partner seem like additional victimization. Jung understood that victim identity construction is particularly powerful because it often contains kernels of truth. Most relationships do have areas where partners could do better. Most people do sometimes feel unappreciated or misunderstood, but during infidelity, these normal relationship challenges get amplified and weaponized to justify betrayal. The seventh pattern is future-focused deflection. Women who are cheating often try to move conversations away from what they've done toward what they want to happen next. They might say things like, "We need to figure out what we both want," or "Maybe we should take a break and see how we feel," or "I think we should focus on moving forward, not dwelling on the past." This future-focused language serves to minimize the impact of their actions and avoid the accountability that comes with fully acknowledging what they've done. It's easier to talk about what's best for both of us going forward than to sit with the reality of betrayal and its consequences. Jung noted that this deflection often comes with spiritual or therapeutic language. Women might talk about growing as people, or finding their authentic path, or following their truth. This language makes it difficult to challenge their choices without seeming closed-minded or controlling. The eighth pattern Jung identified is emotional overwhelm as distraction. When confronted directly about infidelity, women often become extremely emotional, crying, expressing confusion, talking about how difficult everything is for them. While these emotions may be genuine, they also serve to shift focus away from their actions and onto their emotional state. This emotional overwhelm often makes partners feel guilty for pressing for truth or accountability. It's natural to want to comfort someone who's clearly in distress, even when that person has hurt you. Jung warned that this emotional manipulation, often unconscious, can prevent the kind of honest conversation that's necessary for any possibility of healing. The ninth pattern is comparative minimization. Women who cheat often try to minimize their actions by comparing them to worse behaviors. They might say things like, "At least I told you," when they didn't tell you everything, or "It's not like I love him," when love isn't the point, or "Other people have done much worse things," when what others do is irrelevant. This comparative minimization serves to reduce the perceived severity of their actions and make their partner's pain seem disproportionate. It's a way of avoiding full responsibility by suggesting that what they did wasn't really that bad in the grand scheme of things. Now, I want to pause here because I know this information might be triggering if you've experienced betrayal. Jung's insights aren't meant to make you paranoid or cynical. They're meant to help you recognize patterns so you can respond consciously rather than reactively. The final pattern reveals something crucial about healing and recovery. The 10th and final pattern Jung identified is selective remorse. Women who have cheated often express regret, but it's usually focused on the consequences of their actions rather than the actions themselves. They might say, "I'm sorry you're hurt," or "I hate that this happened," or "I wish things could have been different." Notice what's missing from these apologies: ownership of choice and acknowledgement of betrayal. "I'm sorry you're hurt" is different from "I'm sorry I hurt you." "I hate that this happened" makes it sound like an accident rather than a series of deliberate choices. "I wish things could have been different" suggests that the outcome was somehow inevitable. Jung understood that selective remorse serves to maintain the psychological defense mechanisms we've discussed while appearing to take responsibility. It allows someone to seem apologetic without actually dismantling the narratives they've created to justify their behavior. But here's where Jung's insights become truly valuable. He didn't just identify these patterns to help people recognize betrayal. He mapped them out because he understood that awareness was the first step toward healing, both for the person who betrayed and the person who was betrayed. For the betrayed partner, understanding these psychological mechanisms can prevent you from getting trapped in endless cycles of trying to make sense of senseless justifications. When you recognize projection, moral inversion, and temporal displacement, you can stop trying to argue with someone who's operating from a completely different psychological framework. For the person who cheated, becoming aware of these defense mechanisms is the only way to move beyond them. Jung believed that people could only heal and grow when they became conscious of their unconscious patterns. As long as someone remains trapped in projection and rationalization, genuine remorse and change are impossible. This is why Jung emphasized that healing from infidelity, whether you stay together or separate, requires both people to become more psychologically aware. The betrayed partner must understand the psychological dynamics at play to avoid being manipulated or driven crazy by irrational justifications. The unfaithful partner must recognize their defense mechanisms to have any hope of becoming trustworthy again. Now, let's talk about how to apply Jung's insights practically. If you're currently dealing with a partner who's been unfaithful, the first thing to understand is that you cannot reason someone out of psychological defense mechanisms through logic or evidence. These patterns exist to protect the ego from unbearable truths, so they're highly resistant to rational argument. Instead, Jung recommended what he called conscious witnessing. This means observing and naming the patterns without getting emotionally hooked by them. When you hear projection, you can mentally note, "That's projection," without feeling compelled to defend yourself. When you hear moral inversion, you can recognize it as a psychological defense without trying to correct their twisted logic. This conscious witnessing serves several purposes. First, it protects your own psychological well-being by preventing you from being gaslit or manipulated. Second, it allows you to respond from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. Third, it sometimes creates space for genuine conversation because you're not feeding into the defensive dynamics. However, Jung was also clear that you cannot save someone from their own psychological patterns. If a person who has cheated is not willing to become conscious of their defense mechanisms, no amount of understanding or patience from you will create change. The willingness to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves must come from within. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of what he called individuation, the process of becoming conscious of our own psychological patterns and taking responsibility for our own growth. Whether a relationship survives infidelity depends largely on whether both people are willing to do this deeper psychological work. For the betrayed partner, this might mean examining your own patterns that made you vulnerable to manipulation or blind to warning signs. This isn't about blaming yourself for someone else's choices, but about becoming more conscious so you can make better choices going forward. For the unfaithful partner, individuation requires dismantling all the psychological defenses we've discussed and facing the full reality of what they've done. This is extremely difficult and painful work, which is why many people never do it. It's easier to maintain the justifications than to face the shame, guilt, and need for fundamental character change. Jung's ultimate insight about infidelity was that it's always a symptom of deeper psychological unconsciousness. People who are truly individuated, who know themselves deeply and take responsibility for their psychological patterns, rarely betray their stated values in such fundamental ways. This doesn't excuse infidelity or minimize its impact, but it does suggest that healing requires going deeper than just addressing the behavior. It requires both people to become more conscious of their psychological patterns, their unmet needs, their shadow aspects, and their capacity for both creation and destruction. If you're someone who has been betrayed, Jung's insights can help. You understand that the crazy-making justifications you've heard are not about you. They're about psychological defense mechanisms that would be activated regardless of who the betrayed partner was. This understanding can be profoundly healing because it helps you stop taking responsibility for someone else's choices. If you're someone who has been unfaithful, Jung's insights can help you recognize that genuine healing requires dismantling these defense mechanisms and facing the full truth of what you've done. This is the only path to becoming trustworthy again, whether in your current relationship or future ones. But perhaps most importantly, Jung's work reminds us that relationships are mirrors for our psychological development. The patterns that show up in our relationships, both positive and negative, are reflections of our own level of consciousness and psychological maturity. Understanding these psychological patterns is just the beginning of a much deeper journey into conscious relationship and personal development. If you want to continue exploring Jung's insights into relationships, psychology, and personal growth, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Let me know in the comments. Have you recognized any of these patterns? In your own experience, what insights from Jung's work have been most helpful in your journey toward more conscious relationships? Remember, the goal isn't to become paranoid or cynical about relationships. The goal is to become conscious enough to recognize psychological patterns, both in ourselves and others, so we can choose our responses rather than just reacting unconsciously. True love requires consciousness, and consciousness requires the willingness to face uncomfortable truths about human psychology. When we understand the patterns that govern human behavior, we can create relationships based on genuine intimacy, rather than unconscious projection and defense. This is Jung's greatest gift to us, the understanding that psychological awareness is the foundation of authentic love and lasting relationships. The more conscious we become, the more capable we are of both giving and receiving the kind of love that actually transforms us into better versions of ourselves.